In 2024, Samsung's System LSI division, the home of its in-house Exynos mobile processors, posted staggering operating losses, reaching into the trillions of Korean won, a figure equivalent to billions of US dollars. This wasn't a one-off event. It was the culmination of years of immense investment, yielding disappointing returns. This financial black hole exists within a paradox. Samsung Electronics is a global titan, the world's largest manufacturer of smartphones, televisions, and memory chips. It is a company defined by its dominance in hardware manufacturing, a vertically integrated behemoth that controls nearly every component in its devices, from the vibrant AMOLED displays to the high-density NAND flash storage. Yet, for over a decade, it has struggled, often publicly and painfully, to master the single most important component, the system on a chip, SoC, the very brain of its flagship Galaxy smartphones. How can a company so adept at building the body of a device fail so consistently to build its soul? This is not a simple story of failure. It is the story of a multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar quest for something more valuable than market share, technological sovereignty. It's the saga of how Samsung's ambitious journey to build its own chip led to both groundbreaking innovation and infamous public backlash. And it explains why, despite the colossal costs and repeated setbacks, the quest for a true competitive Exynos continues. The story begins in the late 2000s and early 2010s, a period of explosive growth in the smartphone market. As the iPhone redefined personal computing, Samsung rose as its primary challenger, leveraging its manufacturing prowess to rapidly scale production of its Galaxy line of devices. The company was a master of its own supply chain, a key tenet of the Korean chaebol model. But there was a critical vulnerability at the heart of its empire. The SoC, the intricate silicon that houses the CPU, GPU, modem, and other key processors, was largely supplied by an American company, Qualcomm. Samsung's mobile division, which would come to be known as Samsung MX, was one of Qualcomm's biggest and most important customers for its Snapdragon chips. This created a dangerous dependency. Samsung's product roadmaps, its performance targets, and its profit margins were all inextricably linked to a single external supplier. For a company built on the principle of vertical integration, this was an untenable strategic position. The goal was clear. Just as Samsung built its own displays and memory, it needed to control its own silicon. This wasn't just about reducing component costs. It was about gaining control over its own destiny, accelerating innovation, and achieving true independence from a powerful American rival. Samsung's initial strategy was not to invent from scratch, but to assemble. The world of semiconductor design is built on a foundation of licensable intellectual property, IP. At the center of this ecosystem is ARM Holdings, a British company that designs the fundamental instruction set architecture and CPU core blueprints used in virtually all modern smartphones. Samsung became one of ARM's key partners, licensing these off-the-shelf designs to quickly build its own SoCs. The first chip to bear the Exynos brand was the Hummingbird S5PC110, later rebranded as the Exynos 3 Single. Debuting in the original Samsung Galaxy S in 2010, this SoC was built using a licensed ARM Cortex-A8 CPU core and a PowerVR GPU from Imagination Technologies. This was the fast follower strategy in action. By using proven, readily available IP blocks, Samsung's System LSI division could rapidly develop and deploy a competitive SoC without the immense cost and time required for ground-up design. Subsequent generations followed this model, moving to multi-core designs like the Exynos 4 Dual in the Galaxy S2, which used dual ARM Cortex-A9 cores and ARM's own Mali 400MP 4 GPU. This approach immediately yielded a crucial strategic advantage. By having a viable in-house alternative to Snapdragon, Samsung's mobile division gained immense bargaining power. It could prevent Qualcomm from dictating prices and supply, ensuring a stable and cost-effective component pipeline for its hundreds of millions of devices. The relationship between Samsung and Qualcomm throughout this era was one of the most complex and fascinating in the tech industry. They were not simply rivals, they were deeply, and at times uncomfortably, intertwined in a dynamic of co-opetition. First, Samsung MX was a massive customer. For many of its flagship phones, especially those sold in North America, Samsung continued to rely on Qualcomm's Snapdragon chips, making it one of the San Diego firm's most vital revenue sources. Second, Samsung Foundry was a critical supplier. As a leading-edge semiconductor manufacturer, Samsung's foundry business was a key partner for the fabless Qualcomm, fabricating generations of Snapdragon chips on its advanced process nodes. This strategic collaboration dated back to at least 2005 and continued through key nodes like 10 nanometers for the Snapdragon 835. Third, Samsung System LSI was a direct competitor. The Exynos chips it designed were aimed at the exact same premium smartphone market as Snapdragon, often appearing in different regional variants of the very same Galaxy S or Note device. This created a delicate and often tense balance of power. Samsung needed Qualcomm's market-leading modems and, in many cases, its SoCs, but it simultaneously sought to displace them. Qualcomm, in turn, needed Samsung's vast manufacturing capacity to build its chips, even as those chips powered phones that competed with Samsung's and competed against Samsung's own Exynos SoCs within those phones. The early Exynos chips were rarely the undisputed performance leaders. More often than not, they trailed their Snapdragon counterparts, particularly in graphics performance. For a company as obsessed with being number one as Samsung, this might seem strange. But the primary goal of Exynos in this era was not necessarily to beat Snapdragon in benchmarks, but to contain it strategically. The existence of a credible, good enough in-house alternative was a powerful lever in negotiations. The return on investment for the Exynos project wasn't measured in frames per second, but in the billions of dollars saved on component costs and the strategic freedom it afforded the world's largest smartphone maker. It was a tool of negotiation as much as it was a piece of technology. By the mid-2010, being a fast follower was no longer enough. The smartphone silicon landscape was maturing. Apple was demonstrating the profound advantages of tight hardware-software integration with its custom-designed A-series chips, and Qualcomm was differentiating itself with its own custom Cryo CPU cores. To truly compete at the highest level, Samsung needed to graduate from being an assembler of licensed parts to an architect of its own. In 2010, the company made a pivotal move, establishing the Samsung Austin R&D Center, SARC. It staffed this new division by poaching top-tier talent and industry veterans from the likes of AMD, Intel, and even ARM itself. Their mission was audacious: to design a high-performance, low-power, 64-bit ARMv8-compatible custom CPU core from the ground up. This was a declaration of war on the status quo. The first product of this effort was codenamed Mongoose, a custom microarchitecture that made its debut as the M1 core in the Exynos 8-octa 8890 SoC in 2016. For the first time, a Samsung chip would have a brain entirely of its own design. The design philosophy of the Mongoose series was, in a word, aggressive. The engineers at SARC pursued a brute force approach to performance, designing cores that were significantly wider and more complex than the standard ARM designs they replaced. A technical analysis of the third-generation M3 core used in the Exynos 9810 reveals the scale of this ambition. The M3 featured an incredibly wide 6-wide decoder, allowing it to process more instructions in parallel than most of its contemporaries. This made it one of the widest mobile cores in the world, rivaling even Apple's formidable designs. It also boasted a massive 228-entry reorder buffer, a key component for extracting instruction-level parallelism, far larger than the 96-entry buffer in its M1/M2 predecessors. This architectural approach paid off in raw speed. For a brief period, Samsung's custom cores were benchmark champions, achieving the goal of delivering class-leading single-threaded performance. The insurrection seemed to be succeeding. But this power came at a steep price. The wider architecture necessitated a longer instruction pipeline, stretching to 15 stages in the M3 from 13 in the M1/M2. A longer pipeline means that when the branch predictor guesses wrong about the path of code execution, the penalty in wasted cycles is higher. More fundamentally, a wider, more complex core simply consumes more power and generates more heat. The Mongoose was a powerful engine, but it was notoriously inefficient. The culmination of this flawed strategy came with the Exynos 990 in 2020, a chip that would become the nadir of Samsung's mobile efforts. The fifth-generation M5 Lion core, which was supposed to be the pinnacle of the Mongoose project, was a technical disaster. A detailed post-mortem by the experts at AnandTech revealed a cascade of critical design failures. First was the issue of poor voltage scaling. The M5 core required significantly higher voltage to reach the same clock speeds as its M4 predecessor, despite being manufactured on a more advanced 7-nanometer process. In semiconductor physics, power consumption increases exponentially with voltage, so this flaw was catastrophic for efficiency. Peak voltage for the M5 at 2.73 GHz was 1,118 millivolts, up from 1,068 millivolts for the M4, a clear sign of a design that did not scale well. Second, the M5 suffered from high static leakage. Static leakage is power that bleeds from a transistor even when it is switched off. Analysis of Samsung's own power data revealed that the M5 core had 3.8 times the static leakage of the licensed ARM Cortex as 76 cores on the very same chip. This pointed to a much larger physical die area for the M5, making it inherently less efficient even when idle. Finally, there was the problem of scheduling inefficiency. Samsung's own software scheduler, which decides which core should handle which task, revealed that the M5 was notably less efficient than the licensed ARM cores it was paired with. For certain workloads, the smaller, off-the-shelf ARM cores could complete the task faster while consuming less than half the energy. The result was a chip that ran hot, throttled its performance aggressively to avoid overheating, and drained battery life. This created the infamous performance gap between the Exynos and Snapdragon versions of the Galaxy S20, enraging consumers and creating a PR nightmare for Samsung. In late 2019, even before the Exynos 990 was released to the public, Samsung quietly disbanded its Austin-based custom CPU division. There was no grand announcement, no public admission of defeat. It was a silent acknowledgement of a massive strategic failure. After nearly a decade of immense investment and effort, the Mongoose project had ended, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Samsung's quest to build its own CPU core was over. The company would return to licensing standard ARM Cortex-X cores, just like its competitors. The insurrection had failed. Even during the peak of the Mongoose era, when its custom CPUs were trading blows with the best in the industry, Exynos SoCs had a persistent weakness: the graphics processing unit, GPU. Throughout the 2010s, Samsung licensed ARM's off-the-shelf Mali GPUs. While competent, they consistently lagged behind the performance of Qualcomm's custom-designed Adreno GPUs. This wasn't a minor issue. As smartphones evolved into primary gaming devices, a powerful GPU became a critical component of a premium user experience. For gamers, the Snapdragon variants of Galaxy phones were unequivocally superior, offering higher and more stable frame rates. This graphics deficit was a constant thorn in the side of the Exynos project. Having failed in its ambitious quest to build a best-in-class CPU, Samsung executed a pragmatic pivot to solve its GPU problem. In a landmark move in June 2019, the company announced a multi-year strategic partnership with AMD, a giant in the PC and console graphics space. The deal gave Samsung access to license AMD's cutting-edge RDNA graphics architecture for use in its mobile SoC. This was a clear strategic shift. If you can't build it yourself, license it from the best. The first product of this collaboration was the Exynos 920 GPU, based on AMD's RDNA2 architecture, the same foundation powering the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. It debuted in the Exynos 2200 SoC in early 2022. The launch of the Exynos 2200 was rocky. The chip was hampered by manufacturing problems at Samsung Foundry, leading to a generally poor reception and continued performance deficits against its Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 rival. However, the underlying graphics technology showed immense promise. For the first time, a mobile chip brought hardware-accelerated ray tracing to smartphones, a next-generation graphics feature that Qualcomm would not match for several months. By the time the Exynos 2400 launched in 2024 with its updated RDNA 3-based Exynos 940 GPU, the benefits of the AMD partnership became undeniable. While Qualcomm's Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 still held an edge in traditional rasterization performance, the gap had narrowed significantly. And in the forward-looking metric of ray tracing, the Exynos GPU was now on par, and in some stress tests, even superior to Qualcomm's Adreno GPU. From a purely technical standpoint, the Radeon rescue mission had worked. The perennial graphics gap, which had plagued Exynos for a decade, was finally closed. Samsung now had a competitive, future-proof GPU architecture to build upon. Despite progress on the design front, the greatest threat to the Exynos project has never been an external competitor like Qualcomm or Apple. The most persistent and damaging adversary has been internal: Samsung's own semiconductor foundry. The history of Exynos is littered with examples of promising designs being crippled by manufacturing woes. The M5 core's failure in the Exynos 990 was not just a design problem. It was exacerbated by poor yields on Samsung's 7nm process. The potential of the AMD-powered Exynos 2200 was squandered due to significant yield and performance issues with Samsung's 5nm class node. Most recently, the Exynos 2500 was reportedly scrapped entirely for the flagship Galaxy S25 series due to abysmal yield rates on the new 3nm process, forcing Samsung to rely exclusively on Qualcomm for its most important product line. This establishes a clear, recurring pattern. The chip design division, System LSI, delivers a blueprint, but the manufacturing division, Samsung Foundry, cannot produce it at the required scale, performance, or cost. This internal weakness is the project's Achilles heel, a constant drag on its ability to compete with rivals like TSMC, which consistently delivers superior manufacturing results. Samsung's conglomerate structure creates another layer of internal conflict. The mobile division, Samsung MX, is the primary client for Exynos chips. System LSI, the design division, acts as the supplier. This client-supplier relationship is fraught with tension. When Exynos chips underperform, it is the MX division that bears the brunt of the consequences in the form of poor reviews, brand damage, and lost sales. As a result, the MX division has repeatedly made the pragmatic business decision to favor Qualcomm's Snapdragon chips, sometimes using them exclusively in all regions for a flagship launch, as was the case with the Galaxy S23 and is expected for the S25. This creates a vicious cycle. System LSI needs massive guaranteed orders from the MX division to justify the enormous R&D costs of developing a flagship SoC. However, the MX division will only place those orders if the chip is demonstrably competitive and can be supplied in sufficient volume. When the foundry fails and yields are low, MX is forced to turn to Qualcomm, which in turn starves the Exynos program of the scale it needs to be financially viable. This constant internal friction has led to persistent rumors of a major corporate restructuring, with some reports suggesting the Exynos team could be moved directly under the MX division's control, mirroring Apple's integrated structure. Years of performance gaps, overheating issues, and inconsistent battery life have created a significant problem in the court of public opinion. A consumer brand problem. A vocal and influential segment of the tech community and the broader consumer base actively distrusts Exynos-powered devices, creating a negative feedback loop that impacts sales and perception. This trust deficit has been compounded by other issues. In 2023, Google's elite Project Zero security team discovered a series of critical vulnerabilities in Samsung's Exynos modems. These flaws were so severe that they could allow an attacker to remotely compromise a device with no user interaction, simply by knowing the victim's phone number. The vulnerabilities affected not only Samsung's own Galaxy devices, but also Google's Pixel 6 and 7 series, which used Exynos modems, further damaging the brand's reputation for security and reliability. This Exynos allergy is a formidable risk. Even if Samsung manages to produce a technically superior chip in the future, it must first overcome years of accumulated negative perception in the market. Faced with these challenges, Samsung has pivoted its strategy for Exynos. The goal is no longer simply to chase the highest CPU and GPU benchmark scores. Instead, the focus has shifted to a new battleground: on-device artificial intelligence. The latest Exynos chips are designed with a powerful, dedicated neural processing unit, NPU. This specialized processor is engineered to run complex AI models efficiently on the device itself, rather than relying on a connection to the cloud. This is the engine behind Samsung's Galaxy AI feature suite, which includes real-time translation, generative photo editing, and other intelligent capabilities. The advantages of on-device AI are compelling. It's faster, with no network latency. It's more private, as sensitive personal data never leaves the phone. And it's more reliable, functioning even without an internet connection. By positioning Exynos as a leader in on-device AI, Samsung is creating a new value proposition, moving the conversation away from raw gaming performance and toward intelligent, everyday features powered by its NPU. The new AI-centric strategy for Exynos serves a much larger, more critical purpose. The Exynos chip is no longer just a component for a phone. It is a strategic weapon in Samsung's most important battle, the foundry war against TSMC. Samsung Foundry has struggled to win contracts from major clients like Nvidia and Qualcomm for its most advanced manufacturing nodes, such as 3 nanometers and the upcoming 2 nanometer process. The reasons are twofold: persistent concerns about lower yields compared to TSMC, and a reluctance from fabless design companies to entrust their most valuable IP to a direct competitor. How can the foundry prove its cutting-edge technology is viable and ready for mass production? By using it to build its own high-volume, high-profile flagship product. The Exynos 2600, slated for the 2026 Galaxy S26 series, is set to be the first chip manufactured on Samsung's 2 nanometer process node. This transforms the Exynos chip into the ultimate testbed and showcase for the foundry. A successful, high-performing Exynos 2600 would serve as a powerful, real-world demonstration of the 2 nanometer node's capabilities. It would de-risk the technology for massive potential customers like Nvidia and Qualcomm, who are reportedly exploring Samsung as a secondary supplier to diversify away from their total reliance on TSMC. Therefore, the success of the Exynos project can no longer be measured by its own profit and loss statement. Its true return on investment lies in its ability to validate and sell Samsung's multi-billion-dollar foundry investments to the rest of the industry. It is a high-stakes gamble to rebuild client trust and prove that Samsung can compete at the absolute frontier of semiconductor manufacturing.